Hello, Luke. So thank you for joining us. So your investigation reveals some pretty big things. Can you tell me what's the significance of these findings?
I think what's important about the documents that I've seen is they show the range and ambition of Russia in Africa. We know quite a lot about Evgeniy Prigozhin. He's a sort of Kremlin oligarch and action man behind the Wagner Group, which sent mercenaries to eastern Ukraine and to Syria. But we know slightly less about what he's been doing in Africa and in other countries. And what these documents show is that Prigozhin's operatives, his political technologists, his advisors, his soldiers are working in at least 13 different countries. And three countries in particular, they're very active: the Central African Republic, Sudan, which has been the scene of a lot of violence in recent days, and Madagascar.
And why do you think the Kremlin has suddenly shown such great interest in Africa?
I actually think it's linked to what's been happening in Ukraine, primarily after 2014, after Crimea, after the war in the Donbass. There were sanctions against Moscow from America and the European Union, and this has really forced the Kremlin to take a kind of look around and to try and find new geopolitical partners and to find new business deals. And there's been a big push, I think, in Africa. Some of that is public. We know there's going to be the first ever Russia-African summit hosted by Vladimir Putin in October in Sochi, with 50 African heads of state attending. But some of this is subterranean. It's secret, and essentially what the Kremlin is offering via Prigozhin's people is a sort of a package whereby existing rulers are helped to fix elections, to win elections, to discredit the opposition and to stay in power. And in return, Russia is looking to sell arms, to get kind of mining concessions, gold, diamonds, and so on. So it's classic stuff in a way, but it's interesting to see that Russia is doing this at a time when America under Donald Trump is more or less retreating from international affairs and a global role.
So what do you think is Russia's goal in the long run then?
I think Russia's goal is to have international reach across all continents, to be an indispensable player in world geopolitics and a kind of equal or a co-equal to the United States. Now, I have to say, from some of the documents I've seen, that these operations in Africa are not immaculate. Some of the stuff is very crude. For example, documents I've read concerning how the Sudanese government, how Omar al-Bashir, the dictator who was forced out in April, should deal with anti-government protests, which began end of last year. And it really is the Kremlin playbook. It's about smearing the opposition, saying that they're Western stooges, accusing them of being pro-gay rights or Zionist, and so on. So there's nothing very subtle here, and it doesn't always work. But I was surprised by the range. We mentioned Central African Republic, Sudan, and Madagascar, but Russia is also interested in South Africa, in Zimbabwe, in Congo, where military advisors are just arriving after a deal. And it's a big footprint, which to some extent, I think, is reminiscent of Soviet times of the 1950s and 1960s, when the Soviet Kremlin was very keen to support liberation movements across Africa in places like Angola, and to try and kind of squash the imperialists, squash the Americans and their British allies.
And has there been any reaction since the investigation from Russia and from the West? Because, you know, maybe there's something that the West can do to sort of stop this from going on.
Yeah, I think this is quite an interesting area because it hasn't had very much attention. But in terms of reaction at trolling, I mean, I get this all the time from my friends in Moscow, from kind of people working for the state there. I suspect, but I think it's more about actually more of the conversation has been in America with people on the progressive side of politics saying that Donald Trump is essentially by withdrawing from global affairs, is allowing Russia to expand its influence, whether it's in Syria and the Middle East or Central Africa or all sorts of other places. And one of the maps that we got, a Prigozhin map from the end of last year, from the end of 2018, shows that the Kremlin is even interested in some really small, out-of-the-way places. It sent a team of operatives to the Comoros Islands in the Indian Ocean, which most people couldn't find on a map. But the point there is that one of the islands is owned by France, and these Prigozhin technologists were trying to stir up local sentiment against the French. And this is also part of the plan, is to kick out the old colonial powers, the UK, France, shove away the Americans, and to actually try and be the kind of preeminent foreign partner across the continent.
Yeah, there seem to be a lot of mentions of this like rivalry with France, and so I guess you kind of already touched upon it. But I was going to ask you if you could expand on that, like why Russia is so concerned about this.
I think Russia wants to replace the French and the British in different countries. And what's interesting is you can take different views as to how successful Prigozhin has been. But one place where I think Russia has definitely been successful is the Central African Republic. And this map that I've seen claims credit for getting rid of the foreign minister of the Central African Republic and other politicians who, quote unquote, are orientated towards France. They've been pushed out. And in the Central African Republic, the National Security Advisor, Mr. Zakharov, is Russian. And I think this is a sort of more or less a kind of semi-captured state by Russia, and I think is being used or thought about strategically as a kind of bridgehead, as a jumping off point for other countries, for the Congo to the south, for the Muslim north of Africa and so on. And just lastly, what I would say is fascinating about all of this stuff is that it's all being done deniably. This isn't the Ministry of Defense, Russian Ministry of Defense, doing this. It's very reminiscent of what happened in Ukraine. It is mercenaries working for private military contractors, political technologists working for obscure front companies who are doing this. So it's the state and it's not the state. And of course, this suits Putin perfectly because it gives him deniability. So, I mean, he can say, as he said before, that no, there were no Russian troops in eastern Ukraine, no one from the government hacked the American election in 2016, and we as a state are not doing these things in Africa. Well, they are, he is, but under the carapace of a kind of private organization.
How do you think this will develop? Are you going to publish anything? Is there anything else that's left to publish? What do you think what steps should follow now?
Yeah, excuse me. Yeah. I mean, I think we and others will continue to kind of publish and to investigate this. But the logic of the last few years for the Russians, for the Kremlin, for the government in Moscow, is not to throw up your arms and say, "Oh dear, we got caught hacking the American election," or "Oh dear, our covert operations in Ukraine have been exposed." The logic is to carry on and do the same in a very opportunistic way. I mean, the ruling philosophy, I would say, of Putin and his people around the world is let's try it and see. Very often it fails, doesn't work out, it's badly done, but sometimes it succeeds. And there's a kind of criminal energy, dynamism about these people, which means that we can expect similar operations. We can see Russia pushing in Africa, taking advantage of weak states, of corrupt leaders, of corrupt people in business, and trying to kind of rebuild Russia as a global power. Now that's an exaggeration. It isn't a global power, but if you can create that impression, it works well at home with an unhappy domestic population, and it works well abroad in projecting power and influence to the Americans and to other enemies.